Sex, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the speculative interdimensional vehicle, Sex in Space. Its mission, to explore new points of view, to seek out fresh opinions, to boldly go where so many have gone before, and still somehow manage to totally miss the point. Subscribe to Sex in Space, wherever quality podcasts are found.
Hi there, I'm Toshi and welcome back to Sex in Space. We're here continuing to explore sex across all of its infinite dimensions. I hope everyone out there is doing brilliantly. We're excited to have you with us today, whether you're listening in for the first time or you're a frequent traveller of our intergalactic adventures. So thanks so much for being with us, wherever it is that you're tuning in from. Please don't forget to show your support by liking, rating and subscribing. Your feedback means the world to us. Check out our TikTok and Instagram for more great Sex and Space content. Just check for us using our handle at sexandspace.com. That's Sex and Space .com. We always love to hear from our listeners and engaging with our community, so please feel free to reach out in any way you like. Now let's jump into an awesome interview. For this episode, Jane was lucky enough to speak with Justin Hancock, and I'll let her do the honours of introducing him. Without further ado, let's get into it.
Today, I'm joined by Justin Hancock, and Justin is a sex and relationships educator, writer and advice giver for young people, adults and teachers and practitioners in the field, a qualified youth worker, sexual health trainer, who's been working in sex and relationships education for around 25 years, which is pretty impressive. It's made him one of the leading experts in the field, and he's created some amazing resources you do need to know about, and we will be talking about them today. So, welcome, Justin.
Thank you for having me, Jane.
It's such a pleasure. So, the resource that brought you to our attention was basically the BISH UK website. That kind of took me on the journey of realising that there's layers and layers and layers to what you do, and it's a giant project. So what I want to do is start by saying, how did you get into this in the first place?
Into doing BISH or sex education generally?
Education generally, yeah. What tipped it off?
Yeah, so I've got a youth work background. So I did a degree in law, strangely. And at the same time, I was doing youth work whenever I went back home. And I was increasingly finding law very boring and didn't see myself as having a career in it. There are quite a few barriers to doing that as well, from like a kind of working class background. So you can get a degree, but then I found it very hard to, get job placements and then to get enthusiastic about being a lawyer. But I was working in youth work whenever I came back home, and I thought, okay, well, this is much more fun, and also I don't want to sound like one of those kind of worthwhile people saying I wanted to do something really worthwhile. I just really enjoyed it, and it was really good just to have those kinds of working relationships. I was working a lot with young men in particular. As part of my training, I was specifically working around tackling things like sexism and homophobia and racism with young men. Then a job came up working with young men around sex and relationships. I knew nothing at all about sex ed, and my sex ed was as probably bad as most people listening to this podcast when they were growing up. Mm-hmm. Quite embarrassing how little I knew at the time, but just kind of learned on the job, had some excellent training, and over the years I got trained by the local authority where I was living, Derby City Council, and then I moved down to London, worked for Brooke for a few years. And then I was trained by the Sheffield Centre for HIV and Sexual Health in sexual health training back in 2003. And I've been doing it for all that time.
Wow. That's sort of a kind of sideways in. When did you suddenly go, oh, sexual health is my field?
I think actually around 2000, 2001, when the first projects that I was working on were really taking off. I was trying to get more, so my first big project was trying to get more young men to use condoms. So, and to get young men into sexual health services and to get them more interested in using condoms. And it took quite a few months for that before that really started taking off. But what I learned was you need word of mouth to spread. You need enough young men coming in and checking it out and making sure that it's all okay and legit. And eventually it did. And then when all these young men were coming in, so I remember there was a group of lads who would take a bus into town just to come and see me on a Friday afternoon to get some condoms, but also they wanted to ask questions, find out about relationships and sexuality. I was kind of developing like an informal program using leaflets that I was creating at the time. And I guess later that would go on to become Bish. And every week they would come in. They would come in for like 8 weeks, and it would be a 16-mile round journey on the bus to come and see me. And they would bring in more young people each time with them. And I was thinking, they really, really want this. Yeah. And if they're that committed, if these lads are that committed, other lads must be equally committed. It's just about providing young men with the things that they want. I think this is generally true of young people generally and people generally. Yeah. Providing excellent services that they want, responding to their questions, but also setting the right vibe and making it feel okay and making it feel as easy and as comfortable to access a service or to take part in RSE or whatever. And I guess it was from that moment I thought, this feels like it's something that I can do, and therefore I want to keep doing it and want to be as good as possible at doing this.
That's so cool. And so then to now, even that 20-year moment, has described an extraordinary change, particularly with technologies and what's available to young people. Can you kind of describe for me the arc of change that you've experienced in the field over that time?
Yeah, I mean, some things have changed and some things really haven't. Mm-hmm. I think that there's a lot more anxiety about things generally. And I think a lot of that is because there is a lot more what I would call discourse. Well, not what I would call, what Foucault would call discourse. Or what I would call should stories about sex and relationships. And there's more of that because there's more media. And there's more of that particularly because there's more social media. And I think that's opened up some things and really closed some things down. And I think for a lot of young people, generally, it's created a lot of anxiety. And so my work has gone from working with young people who didn't know anything at all, but kind of knew that there were things they didn't know and knew that they wanted to know some things and wanted a space to check things out, to now being young people being so bombarded with discursive messages about how they should be doing relationships and sex and sexuality, gender, and their relationship with themselves, that I have to kind of unpack all of that. That a lot of my job is unpacking all of that and trying to resource young people via their bodies. So, a lot of the work I do is taking this kind of affective approach, which is very popular now, but I think it's popular because it's good, it works, to take this kind of affective turn and to try to relocate young people back into their bodies rather than just being this kind of set of stories about how their bodies should work. I think that's the single biggest change. A lot of people think that pornography has been a huge part of that and that pornography has really changed things. I'm not sure it really has. If there's one change that I've noticed is that from young men back in the day, before hardcore pornography was even legal in the UK, let alone easily accessed via online sources, it wouldn't be uncommon for me to hear from young men, I don't care if she's enjoying it, as long as I'm enjoying it, it's fine. Right. And now I'm much more likely to hear, I haven't heard that for over 20 years. I'm now much more likely to hear, how can I make her come, Justin? Like, how can I be good in bed? How can I last longer? And also how can I do consent? And I think that's something which has really, really shifted. And I don't think that's down to pornography. In fact, I don't try to pin single things down to pornography. I don't think anything has like a simple cause and effect in that way. I think it's an entanglement of factors, but I think that's one kind of key difference I would put my finger on.
The consent one, I mean, we might as well jump there. I was going to go there in a bit, but that is new. How do you talk to young people, and I think probably for parents who listen to this, how do you start to have conversations around consent without it sounding over earnest or abstract?
Well, in person, I found a big change there. So when I used to start teaching about consent, everybody was like, okay, sounds good. Because I'd be framing it as, well, I'm going to teach you how to have consensual sex.
Mm.
This is how we do it. So, like these are the kinds of conversations, the kinds of things to look out for. But now that excitement's been replaced by not
Yeah.
again.
Yeah.
And that's entirely because of discourse. It's entirely because young people have been told for quite a few years now, consent's really important. You have to get it. You have to seek permission from somebody. It's this socio-legal kind of paradigm of consent, which has seeped into sex and relationships education in ways that are not only unhelpful, but are actively causing harm and actually making my job much, much harder. It reifies the idea or retells the idea that men are meant to be active participants, actively pursuing sex, seeking consent, seeking permission from women who are meant to be the passive gatekeepers of sex and sexuality and pleasure. So the young men hate it. The young women hate it. Anyone who isn't straight absolutely hates it. Non-binary folk hate it. They all hate it. And so I have to not only take. I used to have to take students from 0 to 60 in a short space of time because generally speaking, I only get one lesson when I'm working in person. But now I have to kind of take them from like minus 30 to 60. I have to kind of get them on side at the beginning by saying, look, I'm not here to lecture you. I'm here to provide you with some resources that might help you. So I developed the handshake activity where we learn about how we might do consent by going through various handshakes. So, I won't go into too much detail about this. This is written up at my website, bishtraining.com, and it's also it's available for free there, but it's also available in my consent teaching pack. But I find that using an activity where young people get to actually feel what consent feels like to actually experience it in their bodies, is super useful. And that's what RSE has to do. It has to bring us back to the body, and it has to stop these oversimplifying, very basic, patronizing stories about sex and relationships that young people don't find helpful. And for me, I try to talk the talk and walk the walk. If I don't find it helpful, if I don't think in my own personal life, if I don't think I would find it useful, I wouldn't use it.
Right.
And this kind of handing off of the anxieties is kind of passing over. It's kind of like a cosmic game of pass the parcel. That for a lot of people, this stuff is the attitude often is from a lot of educators seems to be, well, I've got this all sorted, so honestly, I don't need to know about this, but I worry about these people over here. Right. Usually, people with less social capital. And so that means that I have to go over there and tell these people how they should do it, whilst not even having a moment of reflexivity about my own practice. So I try to really that's a kind of a guiding principle for everything that I do, both at the website but also in person and on training, is that it's got to be a resource. Everyone's got to feel resourced by the end of it, rather than talked at or given a set of stories.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point you raise about consent and the way that it's framed a lot of the time. I don't think I've had anybody talk about it in quite that way before, but I think that's a very important message for people listening.
Yeah, I mean, I've written a book about it as well. Can we talk about consent? So getting all my plugs in.
That's why we're here.
Well, and the thing is, as you can probably tell, I try to be dispassionate about my job. I try to think of it as a job. It's a job that I try to be good at. And I think we deprofessionalize RSE by making it only about people who are passionate about what they do. I do this because I want to be good at it, and I can see what doing it well can really do. But as you can tell, I do get really passionate about it, particularly when it's done really badly. Because when it's done badly, it just lets the young people down like so much. And actually, it's easier to give young people a resource and to make it as easy as possible for them to take part in the activity, or to take part uh, in this kind of resourceful way. So it's actually easier to do it better than it is to do it poorly, and as well as it just being incredibly useful for everyone concerned, it just makes me quite cross.
Yeah. Now your passion does shine through even when you're in the written space. I'll come to that because it's there was some interesting passion in your blogs. So in terms of the Bish side, obviously that was a culmination of a lot of work. Talk to people about what that is, who it's for, how to use it.
Yeah, so the work I was doing up in Derby that I was talking about before, getting young men into sexual health services, I was doing down here in London when I moved down here. And all the young men and young women were coming in with smartphones. Blackberries, actually, back in the day, that was the one they were using. They'd have two, one for business or Wi-Fi, and then one for fun and like non-Wi-Fi. I love working with those guys. I miss working with them so much. They were a lot of fun. It's often very naughty. So they were coming with smartphones, and I was giving them leaflets. So I've been developing these leaflets over many years that I'd started working on in the early 2000s. I was giving them like printed leaflets with lots of topics related, some related to safe sex, but some related to consent, some related to how to actually enjoy it, some related to bodies and how bodies work and relationships and things like that. And so eventually I thought, well, I'm going to put these leaflets on our website. So I found out about blogging, and very slowly I kind of started to upload some of these leaflets on there, and then to give young people the URL, and that's basically how it worked. And that was kind of around 2010. I started doing that, maybe a bit before, but I did it very, very slowly. But then I started to kind of really work on it much more from 2011, 2012 onwards. I was sponsored for a bit by possibly the world's most famous condom manufacturers, but they don't sponsor me anymore.
I read that, yes.
Yeah, we can get into that at another time if you'd like, or later on.
Get into that a little bit.
All right. So they did sponsor it, which meant that I could spend 2 days a week on it, which I did.
Right.
So a lot of what you can see on there is from the time when I was treating it as a part-time job. And now I can't spend as much time on it, sadly, because I don't have the funding. It's crowdfunded. Again, funding is like it's a pertinent issue, I think, that we could talk about. But I try to spend at least half a day. I'm funded to spend through my Patreon. I'm funded to spend half a day on it a week, but I'll spend more than that on it.
I'm sure it looks that way.
The other thing I'm doing, actually, I should probably mention, I've not really mentioned this in public yet, is that I'm actually doing a PhD about it now. I've just started. Okay. I am a PhD candidate. So I'm using Bish as a case study. So, but that's not really working on Bish. That's working on an independent research about Bish. So, yeah.
The politics of sex ed. When you look at it and you look at the stats, rising STIs, rising unplanned pregnancies, all of the things that tell us that our young people aren't educated adequately around sex. And yet there's just not the investment or the prioritising of it. And in fact, quite the opposite. There's been a pushback in the field. What is it that might be effective to start to shift things back the other way, to push the needle a bit?
It is about money, first and foremost. It's about resources, and it's about money. This is a huge topic. I've written at my website, I've written my website for practitioners, bishtraining.com. I've written a blog about this called The State of RSE in the UK, which gives a history of this, dear listener, if you want like a long read about this. It's kind of slightly autoethnographic. But I think that it's about money and structures. So the local authority where I trained as a youth worker, I was part of their specialist youth work team, delivering all that stuff, the project where young men were travelling for 16 miles on a bus after school on a Friday afternoon. I was part of their specialist youth work team doing specialist outreach projects. Not only does the specialist youth work team not exist, the youth service doesn't exist.
Right.
That's just gone. So, which is tragic for young people. It's tragic for communities in which the youth services were working, like really tragic. And I think we've really, really missed that. And it's only really now that people are talking about how tragic that was. This happened as a result of the 2010 cuts, the austerity cuts that happened in the UK under the coalition and then the Tories after that. Youth services were a bit under threat before that anyway, for other reasons. But yeah, so I'm talking about money, but also structures. And it's about having this kind of level of expertise, which we really need. So back in the day, before RSE became mandatory in the UK, which I actually think was a really bad idea, I'm one of the few sex educators who thinks mandatory RSE is a really bad idea, but we can talk about that later if you want. But before it became mandatory a couple of years ago, back in the day when there was funding and when there were youth services, the approach was, okay, we need to try to get into this school. Has anyone got into this school? Has anyone got a contact for this school? So there were so many local services that were trying to get into schools, a combination of youth services, but also sexual health outreach services, to get into schools, to help schools to deliver their RSE, but also to link young people to the services locally. And they would get this for free. They would get all this free support. In fact, we'd be banging on their door saying, let us give you free support, give us room in the timetable. And now it's, I'll get an email from a school who don't have anywhere locally. They found out about me on a website, or they heard me on the radio, or someone sent them an email or something, asking me to come in. And then I say, well, I cost this much. And they're like, oh, okay, well, we can afford you to come in for this. And that's it. So they don't have the free support. They don't have people banging on the door, and they don't have to pay. They don't have to pay for it. So that's a huge change. And quite frankly, we're going to have to move mountains to overcome that the cuts and the devastation that austerity politics have caused in this arena. But also just in terms of online stuff, like, of course, even if we had really great RSE happening in schools, we need really good online RSE as well, websites like mine. But there are huge funding challenges around that. Massive. Of course, I don't want to speak for charities, but so I'm just going to speak gently and just kind of euphemistically. Charities often say to me that they can't do what I can do because they might get into trouble with their funders, or they might perceive that they'd get into trouble with their funders. So where I can quite happily talk about, well, here's how we might make sex more pleasurable, or, to quite easily talk about, why we need trans-inclusive RSE, or to deliver trans-inclusive RSE myself. I just think that's what we do. That's what it is. I don't have to deal with any of those anxieties around funding from the charities might have to face. But the other sources of online sexuality education, their primary focus isn't to resource people going to their websites. Their primary focus is to score in Google rank. So one of my main competitors in Google rank are fertility tracker apps, who have, through very good search engine optimization, managed to rank really, really well for some of the terms that young people are searching for to find my website.
Right.
And, the content's crap, but they score highly because they know how to kind of game the system. They've got people there who are SEO copywriters, like copywriters for Google, rather than educators for the end user. Yeah. But also there's the manosphere, so alt-right kind of places online where they give an awful lot of relationships and sexuality advice to young men who are not served by that advice. They don't want to resource those young men with useful kind of with useful tips and helpful guidance and activities for reflection. They want to tell young men how they should be more like an archetypal man, which is deeply problematic. And pornographers are now doing, I'm saying pornographers like I despise pornographers. I sound like Mary Whitehouse. Like people doing pornography, like porn websites are now getting in on this as well and doing sex ed, and some of them doing a good job. But again, let's say they're competing with me, I suppose. So for educators who are delivering stuff online, the funding issue is a challenge. So if there's more funding for all of this, that would be good. Part of what I hope comes out of my PhD is that it would lead to a greater knowledge in the field about what we should be doing, about the kinds of quality standards. Maybe it might lead to a kind of quality standards kind of thing, but also might kind of put it more on the map generally within the research community. But yeah, all round, the lack of funding for this has created an issue. And I sometimes ask myself, well, why is this?
Yeah.
And I think it comes down to it's our own sex ed. It's the common sense messages we received about relationships and sexuality education. I count myself as being a person on the left. My project is a leftist project in many ways, and I try to be a comrade. But the left don't care about this topic at all, because what have they been taught about sexuality and relationships education? What was their sex ed like? Well, it taught them that sex is this very, very narrow set of things, and that it's meant to be unpleasurable, but also that it's awkward and that we're not supposed to talk about it. And so that becomes the common sense that then becomes handed down. When I say common sense, I'm using that in the Gramscian term, like the set of stories that we're led to believe about sex reveal this kind of imminent nature of humans and sexuality that's meant to be tricky to talk about. It's not. Absolute bollocks. It's just what we've been taught to think. Speak to someone who grew up in the Netherlands. Someone who grows up in the Netherlands can talk about sex and relationships like they can talk about any other topic. In fact, they talk about it in a way which is so blasé and matter of fact that they're almost bored by the topic. Okay, it's a cultural, it's specifically a culturally handed down intergenerational thing. And so I think, go on, sorry, Jane. So just to finish that point, so I think this also is part of the assemblage of why it is that it's not advocated for. So it's not advocated for, which means that we have few advocates. So when the right wing come for my work, I don't get anyone standing up for me on the left. I get very few people standing up for me generally, but outside of sex education. Because of what they're taught, which means that it's harder to attract funding. It's harder to make the case for what we're doing with funders because they don't know what good looks like, quite frankly.
Yeah. I mean, one of my questions was going to be, what are some of the big challenges to offering a good sex education? You've just done a nice unpacking of them. And I think, from our end, one of the key spaces of conversation for us is with parents.
Yeah.
To seek to try to create awareness that particularly parents of young children, that they really need to get engaged with the fact that this is the equivalent of saying, sorry, your children aren't allowed to do any PE.
Yeah.
It's just not in their best interest for us to get them physical. Like, what?
Yeah. I think parents have the same anxieties that I was talking about that young people have. It's there are all these discourses flying around about, saying the right thing, or what will it lead to, or who am I, questioning what it is to be a parent, almost talking about this. I should say at this point I'm not a parent, but sure, I can understand why everyone is anxious about it, but when we understand that our anxieties come from our own sex ed, that's basically where they started.
Yeah.
And if we were taught something else, I think we'd feel less anxious.
Yeah, I feel like maybe, and I'm such a Pollyanna, but that at least with parents, they've got to an age and stage where they've got enough experience to understand that maybe that could be part of the problem. And so there's a little more receptivity there than going sort of straight into the political sphere or into spaces of governance. But I'm going to go to your blog, which you mentioned, which clearly there's a left-right conversation going on in your work. And one of the things that threw up for me is whether there's a way to evaluate politicians on the basis of their attitudes enough. Like, do we have a framework of assessment for who we're voting for to go, what are your values around X, Y, Z, sex education or, social support? Or, I mean, is there such a thing?
I mean, there is. I mean, in the UK, there is this "They Vote for You" website, but it's interesting because I think this is, the quadrant of left wing, right wing economically, and then authoritarian, libertarian. The matrix that I'm talking about. So this is very much a kind of sex ed is kind of like an authoritarian, libertarian thing, and you get leftist authoritarians who really think sex ed is just rubbish. You do get, quite transphobic, for example, left wingers.
Yeah.
But you do get, I've met I met a Tory MP once who's actually very pro sex ed because he's a liberal.
Yeah.
And he saw it as being important. And in the UK at the moment, there have been several. Well, no, I'm about to make a petty point about Tory politicians in the UK at the moment. If you just Google sexual offences and Tory MPs, or Tory MPs being kicked out of the Commons, or Tory MPs losing the whip, you'll probably see that there's probably a lot of cause for sex ed to happen with Tories. But I think that it's interesting politically, and so as a kind of a left liberal, I think that occupying that kind of bottom left-hand quadrant, dear listener, if you're familiar with the quadrant I'm talking about, if not, you can find it online. I think it's an interesting space where I'm on the one hand saying, I'm saying liberal left things. A useful kind of, I suppose, a useful kind of hook for this is the stuff that I've written recently about porn. So I've written off the back of this really great Financial Times investigation into the porn industry. I wrote a couple of articles, and also based off this brilliant book called Bodies of Work by Rebecca Saunders that I read for my podcast, which is an exceptionally good, complex, but exceptionally good book. So I wrote a couple of pieces for Bish about how capitalism and pornography are doing a number on us, basically. That it's not porn in and of itself, but it's how capitalism has captured porn and captured in many ways our desires in ways that and in order to explain why it is that many young people, often young men, feel quite shitty about their relationship to porn. It's not so much about the pornographers or the people in the porn. It's capitalism that's done it. That's kind of deliberately invoking in them a sense of lack, where they can never really feel satisfaction. And I'm talking here about, I'm using a Deleuze-Guattarian kind of analysis of capital, where any kind of sense of lack is something which capital is kind of creating. And so, obviously I've explained it. I've explained this in a way that a teenager can understand, hopefully. Although I think I do mention Deleuze-Guattari probably in the article, but, towards the end. I think that's kind of like an interesting, left liberal kind of way of looking at it. I think it's really important because so many of the things that are causing anxiety in young people, that making people anxious about sex and relationships, are promulgated by platform capitalism, by platforms competing with each other to compete for our attention in the attention economy, and making us feel shitty about ourselves. And if we just look at social media, for example. So I think it's really important that we, for me, I think it's really important to bring in leftist arguments as well as liberal arguments as a way of giving young people the resources to see a way out of it, to come back to being in their bodies and to kind of reclaim their bodies from what capitalism does, and in order to help them to become other and to be with their people in their lives and to become, basically.
Yeah, it's an interesting framing. We have a book coming out in the next couple of weeks on how to talk with your kids about porn.
I saw that, yeah.
And our attitude to it is, it's materials that are meant to be arousing on the problem. It's what gets put into that space.
Yeah.
the relationship that we have with that. And so critical awareness, and there's good stuff, and then there's stuff that really is perpetuating problems and significant social harms at times. And the thing that triggered this whole project at the very beginning was me. Did you see that brilliant doco on the sex educator who was working in the school in the north years ago? It must be about a 15, 20-year-old doco. And she was from the Netherlands. And there was she was working with the sixth formers, kind of doing the equivalent of an O level in sex.
Was that on Channel 4? Yeah.
There was a moment where she asked one of the young men, "How do you know when sex is finished?" And he looked down the spout and he went, "It's when you come on her face, isn't it?" And that was a defining moment for me, because it's also standing in as a tool for education when there's nothing else available. And so it's all of those arguments kind of mashing up and weaving through each other that make it such an interesting space to look at, certainly. But again, back to the poor old parent who's being terrorized by the media. How do I start this? What do I do? How do I deal with it without alarming them?
Yeah, I mean, I think for parents, a really good activity, dear listener, if you're a parent, is to think back to a time. So let's assume that we've all had quite bad sex education, but some of us haven't, but many of us have. In my experience, when I do training around this with teachers, most of us have. In fact, almost everyone has. But even though we've had not very good sex education, as ill-equipped us and made us feel uncomfortable and awkward talking about sex, we're all adults. We've all probably had at least one vaguely useful conversation about sex and relationships in our lives. What were you doing? What were you doing that made that a useful conversation? And really try to bring it to mind, like in a really kind of lively way in your head, and try to take yourself back to that precise moment in time and think about the tiny things that you were both, or all of you were doing that made that conversation just that little bit easier. So a lot of people say that they were listening, but how did you know that you and the other person were listening? What were you doing? What were you doing with your bodies? What space were you in? Can you describe the vibe in a very vivid detail? What were you doing to add to that vibe? How did you know you felt safe enough? How did you know that trust was there? How did you know when to start the conversation? How did you know when to end? How did you feel comfortable enough talking about things that were giving you a sense of discomfort, but how did you know when you started to feel a little bit more comfortable, or comfortable enough to say what you wanted to say? So really try to bring that to mind. Write all of those things down and then think, okay, well, how can I bring more of this into my conversations with my kids? How can I create the vibe? How can I make it as easy as possible? That's what facilitation means. So how can I facilitate this? How can I make this as easy as possible? Yeah. Bearing in mind that it's not always easy, but how can we make it that little bit easier? So it's, as well as kind of paying attention to what's worked for you before, your own resources that you already have, you might also want to break it down into bite-sized chunks, kind of normalize the conversation, pin your ears back, and be ready to ask a useful question or an interesting or a challenging question. If you're watching TV or something comes up in the media, you could ask a really great question. And the crucial thing is, and I know that Professor Alan McKee's talked about this a lot and with colleagues and have written about this a lot, which is one of the things that comes up is when young people see, or particularly when children see a sexual image, they're mostly anxious about what their parents might think rather than anxious about the image of itself, which says to me that the most important, not message, but the most important resource that we can give to children is the understanding that it's actually fine. It's all just fine. Just come to us. It's all right. Nothing bad's going to happen. Let's talk about it. And it's awkward. It might feel awkward, but locate where awkwardness feels. And when we feel awkward in other aspects of our lives, what do we do to make ourselves feel that? 10% less awkward. What do we do?
Yeah.
And I think all of that stuff is where I'd start, really. And again, it is like coming back to the body. What does the body do? How can we affect each other in ways where it's a bit easier?
What you made me think of, or what came into my head when you were talking, was that lovely space where people are around a kitchen table having a cup of tea, laughing together. as they explore that topic, which is quite a feminine space of activity, to be fair. But it can be broader, and humour is a great way to just relax and to be chill. But the formal conversational idea that I grew up with, we need to talk about. No, we don't.
No, cringe.
Kids want their parents to be able to have conversations with them. They just don't want formality, huh?
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. I was doing a training course day before yesterday, and the teachers were sitting around a small table playing this game that I have. My favourite resource that I use at my website, Talking Sex Ed. And they were sitting around chatting for half an hour chatting about sex and relationships, and they're all kind of as a hubbub in the room. And I said afterwards, you're all sitting around these small little tables, and it reminds me of people being at the pub, and how which is it's a very UK thing, obviously. It's like, and they're less they're less full of men as they used to be back in the day, but there's a real intimacy that you can have, even with a room full of people sitting on these small tables with each other. What do we do then when we're talking about our relationships or something which feels quite private? But the fact that we can talk about quite private things in such a public space.
Yeah.
Obviously, maybe alcohol helps. Don't get your children drunk. I'm not suggesting that, but it's just thinking about when we're out with our adult friends, like what do we do in those moments that just make that conversation feel a bit easier, is all I'm saying there, really. Yeah. But the fact that we can do that in a pub demonstrates that we can do it.
So today, then, what do you find young people are worrying about most? What if I were a parent of a young person and I got to the point where they were already in their teens and I'm like, oh, Lord, I've left this late. What are they worrying about? What should I understand about their world right now?
Well, they're not worried about anything that the media is telling you should worry about. There are so many moral panics about young people and sex and relationships, and they're almost all invariably all wrong. So, so try and pay less attention to that, and it is more about kind of pinning your ears back and paying attention to what your kids might be saying or what young people might be saying generally. I don't think it's kind of easy to generalize around a particular topic. I think that a lot of it is the stuff that I've mentioned. A lot of it is that they are worried about the messages that they're being told, the should stories or the discourses. I think they're worried about, am I being the ideal sexual Athenian, to think about Foucault, for a moment, thinking about whether they're doing it right, whether they are being a man right, or being non-binary right, or being a woman right. I think there's a lot of messages about gender that people were finding tricky, we're all finding tricky. They do worry about consent, but I think that it's easier just to do consensual things rather than to talk about consent. So next time you're watching a TV show with your kids or with anyone, like, figure out who holds the remote. That's like a key consent question when you're figuring out what to watch. What are we in the mood for? What kind of genres take a fancy? Do we want something familiar or something entirely new? How are we going to watch it? Is it okay if one of us kind of half watches it on our phone, or can we watch something? Are we allowed to talk through it? Can we kind of hate watch something and take the piss, or do we have to seriously watch something? How long are we going to watch something for? And then when you have a break to go to the loo or to get some popcorn or to get some water or a cup of tea or whatever, check in with each other. Well, are we still up for this? I noticed you weren't laughing during the funny bits, or I noticed you weren't really scared, or you seemed a bit bored. We could do something else. And then really trying to pay attention to those feelings of what happens when you come together in ways that feel really good. All of this is consent work, all of it. And if you actually do it and kind of say, remember when we were picking something to watch on TV the other day and how we kind of made it work. Basically, when you have sex, that's kind of what you got to do. It might be a bit trickier when it comes to sex, but basically you got to do all of that. That's it. And so it's that kind of embodied experience. So I think for my my takeaway for parents or anyone working with young people is, can you give people, as best as you can, the experience of it? Can you put it in their bodies? Can you give them the feeling of it? Like the actual, the embodied cognition is what I'm talking about here. That can you really make them, like, give them, not make them, give them the opportunity to really feel it.
Yeah.
That's way more important than a conversation or a set of conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really good advice. And so, what are your goals for the future? Albeit that you have said you're sometimes thinking you might do something completely different.
Well, I've got to do the PhD now, so I owe Nottingham Trent University 80,000 words on what else do sexuality education websites do. That, and I'm going to keep plugging away on the website and running training courses.
Cool.
I've got an advanced training course that I've delivered a couple of times, which I've really enjoyed doing. So I'll run another one of those next year, I think. But other than that, I don't really plan beyond a year, because I don't really usually know whether there's, every year I have to have usually I have to have a bit of a reckoning over, is there enough work out there, because I'm freelance? Is there enough work out there for me to keep doing this? Is it worth all of the not very good stuff? Can I still make this a job? Basically, is this still a job?
Yeah.
So that's but I know that at least for 3 years that's not something I have to worry about that much, thankfully.
And how can people support the work you're doing? You mentioned that it is possible. Let's make that clear for people if they come to your website.
Yeah, well, if you're a sex educator, you could buy some resources at bishtraining.com. That'd be awesome. But also, there are lots of ways to support Bish, the website for young people. So if you go to bishuk.com/support, there's a whole load of things you can do on there. Like, money is really useful. Like, all I need is 1,000 Patreon subscribers, and then I can get back to working on it for 2 days a week, basically. Like, it would replace all of the funding that a very famous condom manufacturer used to give me to put their logo on my website. So if I can get 1,000, 2,000 Patreon subscribers forever, then I can keep the website going forever, basically, until I die or until I hand it over to someone or train someone up. So,
there you go, parents. If you're going over to take a look at the website or sending your kids, which is a good idea, then treat it like Wikipedia and give something to the cause.
Yeah, I give money to Wikipedia, yeah. But also good web links. So if you run a website which is a health website or a government website or an education website, please give me a web link. So just say, if for example, for a good sex ed resource, go to this website, because Google likes that. I know it's stupid, but Google really likes it. Yeah. Google doesn't like it so much if porn folk, I've called you pornographers before, please, disregard that. Many of my friends, I've known good colleagues who work in porn. I love you all very much. But clicks from porn websites aren't good. So if you can link from your social media, that would be ideal. Also got some posters on there that you can print out and put up in your schools or youth clubs. It's aimed at everyone over 14, so in the spaces where young people are a little bit kind of older teenagers. That's all the stuff you can do to support it. So not just money, but please money.
And very briefly, because I'm conscious, we could talk for a long time. The condom maker, whose name shall not be mentioned if you don't want, that transition from basically supporting RSE and RSE initiatives, and now having it feels like they've been slightly pushed out by the same voices that you were saying have had a go at you, had a really good go at them about their activity.
Yeah.
And it's that paradox of talking to young people about condoms at young ages, 13, for example, which was one of the big headliners, and the fact that 13-year-olds are often sexually active. So yes, that's a good idea, but they got chased out, and now they've kind of gone, it seems overt perhaps to you and I, but covert for a lot of people, is they've gone to League of Legends online gaming.
Right.
As their sponsorship space. So they're where young people are,
Yeah.
They're just not doing it in a way that's going to get them beaten over the head for being there.
Yeah, and you know, I'm a leftist, so I resented taking the money anyway, but it was really useful and I made use of it. But that's how capital works. At the end of the day, it's always about the bottom line. There's a difference between capitalism and commercial activity, and in fully automated luxury gates-based communism, that I'm striving for. We'll still have like commercial activities and companies and things. We'll still be able to buy sourdough bread if we want, as well as getting our state-mandated loaf of bread every day that we get, the state gives us. We can also go and buy, a fancy sourdough if we wanted. If we wanted to do something as bourgeois as that. But this is, so we'll still have condom manufacturers, but perhaps they might. Sorry, I'm talking. Really giving a thesis about giving a lecture about post-capitalism, but yeah. So that's how I think it's basically how capital works, and I kind of get it. I don't think it was any one thing that caused them to stop sponsoring my website. It just is like, well, if this is a bit too much hassle, and we have to employ people who are going to handle this, to really invest in this, we're going to really need to have people on board who are copywriters, who are experts, who can advise us, who can give us a steer on the kinds of things that we could and should be saying, then I get it, and there's not a lot of margin in condom manufacture, I guess, so they think, well, sod it. And also the same company who owned the condom manufacturer also owned, COVID was part of it as well. They also owned several products that were very relevant to COVID. So I think that's part of it. But, they're multinational companies, basically, at the end of the day. Yeah. The people who should really sponsor my ones are people like, Ben and Jerry's or someone like that. Yeah. That's but they're owned by Unilever, so they probably have the same issue. But
well, yeah, not necessarily if it's ice cream.
If there is so here's my pitch. If you are a big commercial company and you would like to sponsor a website visited by thousands of young people every day, I'm listening. I'm open. I'm all ear. I'm deaf in one ear, so I'm all ear. Please, I do have 2 ears, but I can only hear out of one. I'm all ear, so please do feel free to come and fund me. I'll be very nice about you.
It's a really worthy cause, because without good sex education, the results are in. This isn't news for anybody.
No.
It's better outcomes for young people all round, and the Netherlands, again, are a good case in point for this.
Yeah.
And the poor outcomes across relationships, health, well-being, particularly within the queer community, are shocking. So, sponsors, this is a very good place to invest your money. Awesome. Well, look, it's been a complete pleasure, and we look forward to doing it again when you've got your PhD results.
We really hope you enjoyed this episode. To find more of Justin and his work, head on over to justinhancock.co.uk. Before we sign off, we want to remind you that our book, The Organ Education Forgot, is now available both as a downloadable PDF and as a physical copy, so you can read it in whichever format you prefer. Both are available at sexandspace.com/book. Please make sure to leave a like, follow, comment, or review wherever you're tuning in from. Your support means the world to us. Until next time, safe travels and see you on the next episode.